Democrats for 2 years in a row had not received any COLA, that maybe it was the right thing to do because we know that health care costs and prescription drug costs are soaring, that maybe we provide a $250 check to those seniors and disabled veterans one time. I could not get one Republican vote in support of that proposition. We won 53 to 45, but around here it doesn't take 50 votes to win. It doesn't take a majority to win. It takes 60 votes. We couldn't get one Republican vote. So here you have every Republican voting against a $250 check for a disabled vet or a senior citizen who's living on $15,000, $16,000 a year. Can't afford it. But we can afford a $1 million a year tax break for somebody who's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, somebody may understand that rationale. I don't. I really don't. I can't understand that. I can't understand asking our kids and grandchildren to pay more in taxes as the national debt goes up in order to provide tax breaks for the richest people in this country. So, Mr. President, while there are some good provisions in this bill, and certainly extending the tax breaks for 98% of our people, for the broad, very broad middle class, I think if the American people demand it in our democracy, we can do better. Now, I don't know if you or I alone will be able to convince some of our Republican friends or maybe some of our Democratic friends to make this into the kind of proposal we need for the working families of this country and for our children, for our next generation. I don't know that we can do it inside this beltway. As I said earlier, I think that the way we win this battle, the way we defeat this proposal and come back with a much better proposal, is when millions of Americans start writing and emailing and calling their senators, their congresspeople, and say, wait a second, are you nuts? Do you really think that millionaires and billionaires need a huge tax break at a time when this country has a $13.7 trillion national debt? What are you smoking? How could you for 1 second think that that makes any sense whatsoever? And I'll tell you something, Mr. President, I don't know what my phones are doing today in my office right now, but in the last 3 days we have gotten, I'm guessing, 5,000 phone calls and emails, and about 99% of them are in disagreement with this proposal. Well, I'm looking at a chart here, and we've gotten 2,100 calls that just came in, I'm informed, today. So the overwhelming people who are calling me, I don't know what kind of calls other members of the Senate are getting, but certainly those are the calls that I am getting. Now, also, Mr. President, and this point cannot be made strongly enough, what our Republican friends want to do, and they've been pretty honest and upfront about them, especially some of the extreme right-wing people who have been running office, and in some cases have won. And in some cases have won. They have been honest enough to say that they want to bring this country back to where we were in the 1920s. That their ultimate aim is to basically repeal almost all of the provisions that have been passed in the last 70 years to protect working people, the elderly, and the children, working people accruing the interest on their loans. So I think that if the President believes that if this agreement is passed, that the Republicans are going to come to the table and we're all going to live happily in the future, we're going to all work together in a nonpartisan way, I think he's not understanding the reality. These people are going to come back, and they're going to come back very aggressively for major cuts in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, environmental protection, education, child care, Pell Grants, you name it. Because their belief is, I don't quite understand it, that it is somehow good public policy to give tax breaks for the wealthiest people in this country, who in many ways have never had it so good, while you cut programs that the middle class and working families of this country desperately depend upon. So I would suggest that this big debate we're having right now on whether or not we should accept the proposal agreed to by the President and the Republicans is just the beginning of what's coming down the pike. And if we surrender now on this issue, we can expect next month and the following month another governmental crisis, another threat of a shutdown, unless they get their way. So I think rather than asking the working families of this country to have to compromise, instead of asking our kids to pay more in taxes to bail out billionaires, maybe, I know this is a radical idea, but maybe we should ask a handful of our Republican friends to join us. Maybe a handful of honest conservatives over there who have been telling us for years their great concerns about deficit spending and a huge national debt. Maybe they should be prepared to vote against a proposal which raises the national debt and our deficit by giving tax breaks to some of the richest people in the world. Now, I quite frankly don't think that I'm going to be able to convince them. I don't know that you're going to be able to convince them. But you know who I think can convince them? I think their constituents can convince them. I think the American people can convince them. And I think, as I said earlier, that if the American people stand up, that we can defeat this proposal and that we can create a much, much better proposal. Clearly, we must extend tax breaks for the middle class. Clearly, we must make sure that unemployed workers continue to get the benefits that they desperately need. But equally clearly, we must make sure that we are not raising the national debt, which, as sure as I'm standing here, will result in cuts in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education, other programs, by passing, if this proposal is passed. So, Mr. President, this is not only an important proposal unto itself. $900+ billion, even in Washington, is nothing to sneeze at. But it is an important proposal in terms of the direction in which our country goes into the future. If we accept this proposal of a 2-year extension for the richest people in America, I believe that will eventually become either a long-term extension or a permanent extension. If we accept the proposal that lowers the rates on the estate tax, which benefits only the top 0.3%, 99.7% of Americans get nothing. But if we give them what they want, I believe that over a period of years, it will lead to the complete abolition and ending of the estate tax, which will cost us $1 trillion over a 10-year period. So I would hope that this issue is not one that just progressives or moderates feel strongly about. I would hope that honest conservatives, who in their heart of hearts believe that this country is seriously endangered when we have unsustainable deficits and a huge national debt, that they will tell their elected officials here in Washington not to pass a piece of legislation, which increases the national debt significantly and, in fact, will allow for the permanent, over years, in my view, extension of these tax breaks. So that is what this debate is about. It is about, fundamentally, whether we continue the process by which the richest people in this country become richer at a time when we have the most unequal distribution of income and wealth of any major country on earth. And as I've said earlier, Mr. President, this is not an issue that is discussed. I don't know, well, I do know why, it's just not an issue that people feel comfortable talking about because they don't want to give affront to their wealthy campaign contributors or take on the lobbyists that are out there. But that is the reality. Throughout the entire world, the United States has the most unequal distribution of income, top 1% earning 23.5% of all income. That, Mr. President, is more than the bottom 50%. And that is not just immoral, it is bad economics, because if the middle class gets crushed entirely, who is going to be buying the goods and services produced in this economy? So this piece of legislation, as important as it is unto itself, and it is very, very important, is equally important in terms of what it says about where we are going into the future. Are we going to protect the middle class and working families of our country? Are we going to make sure that every young person in America, regardless of income, has the ability to go to college? Or are we going to allow college to become unaffordable for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of bright young people, or else force them to leave school deeply in debt? Are we going to create a health care system which guarantees health care to all of our people, high-quality health care? Or are we going to continue a situation where 45,000 Americans die each year because they don't have access to a doctor? Are we going to invest in our energy system so that we break our dependence on foreign oil? We spend about $350 million a year importing oil from Saudi Arabia and other foreign countries, almost $1 billion a day, which should be used to make this country energy independent, which should be used to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel into energy efficiency and sustainable energy, technologies such as wind, solar, geothermal, and biomass. So, Mr. President, and by the way, none of that has been addressed, as I understand it, in this proposal. So my point here is not just that this proposal is a bad proposal as it stands before us now, but it is going to move us in the future in a direction that I do not believe this country should be going. I mentioned earlier that my own personal family's history is the history of millions and millions of Americans. My father, as it happened, came to this country at the age of 17 without a nickel in his pocket, worked hard his whole life, never made very much money. But he and my mom graduated high school, she never went to college, but they had the satisfaction, a very significant satisfaction, of knowing that their kids got a college education. My older brother Larry went to law school, and I graduated from the University of Chicago. And I think what's going on in this country and why the anxiety level is so high is not just that people are worrying about themselves. Parents worry more about their kids than they do about themselves. And what parents are sitting around and they're worrying about now is they're saying, will, for the first time in the modern history of this country, my kids have a lower standard of living than their parents? Will my kids earn less income? Will my kids not have the education that I have? Will my kids not have the opportunity to travel and learn and grow as I have done? Are the best days of America behind us? That's really what the question is about. And I don't think that has to be the case. But I will tell you, as I mentioned earlier, if we are going to change the national priorities in this country, if we're going to start devoting our energy and our attention to the needs of working families and the middle class, we have got to defeat this proposal. We've got to defeat similar type proposals which come down the pike. When this country has a $13.7 trillion national debt, it is insane, nothing less than insane, to be talking about huge tax breaks for people who don't need them. And again, as I mentioned earlier, ironically, You got a lot of these millionaires out there who apparently love their country more than some of the people in this chamber. You have some of the richest people in America, Bill Gates, and all the good charitable work he does, Warren Buffett, and many others who are saying, you know what, I'm doing just fine. I'm a billionaire. I'm a multimillionaire. I don't need your tax break. I'm worried about the fact that we have the highest rate of childhood poverty. Invest in our kids. I'm worried that our infrastructure is crumbling. Invest in our infrastructure. I'm worried that 45,000 Americans are dying this year that don't have access to health care. Invest in health care. I'm worried about global warming. Invest in transforming our energy system. These are patriotic Americans. They are rich. They love their country. And now what they are saying to us is we don't even want it. We are giving people money who in some cases don't even want it. And I do know, that there are others out there who do. And I think, Mr. President, if there is one issue that we as a Congress and as a government have got to address, and that is the extraordinary level of greed in this country. We have got to stand tall and draw a line in the sand and simply say, enough is enough. How much do you want? How much do you need? How many yachts can you own? How many homes can you have? Isn't it enough that the top 1% now earns 23.5% of the income of this country? How much more do they want? Do they want 30%, 35%? Isn't it enough that the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90%? How much more do they need? Mr. President, I mentioned earlier when I talked about the situation that got us into this horrendous recession, and that is the collapse of Wall Street. And I talked about what I think most Americans understand very well, and that is the incredible greed and recklessness and dishonesty that exist on Wall Street. We must not allow ourselves to encourage and continue the kinds of greed that we have seen in recent years. It is an abomination that the people who caused this economic crisis, the worst recession since the Great Depression, that the people who caused it on Wall Street are now earning more money than they did before we bailed them out. Earlier today, I was reading some emails that came to my office from Vermonters who were struggling to keep their heads above water. And they were just terribly painful and poignant stories about honest and good and decent people who are now choosing about whether or not they should put gas in their car or buy the food that they need or buy the prescription drugs they need. Not just a Vermont story, it is an American story. And that is the reality out there for tens of millions of Americans. So in my view, we can negotiate a much better agreement than the one that President Obama and the Republican leadership did. There are some good parts of that agreement which obviously should be retained and perhaps even strengthened. And those include, of course, making sure that we extend unemployment benefits to those who need it, and of course that we extend tax breaks for the middle class. And there are some very good other provisions in there which I think are very worthwhile. But I think if the American people stand up and agree with those of us who say no more tax breaks for the very wealthiest people in this country, we can defeat this proposal and we can come up with a much better one that is fairer to the middle class of this country and is fairer to our young children. I do not want to see our young kids, my children, my grandchildren, have a lower standard of living than their parents. That's not what America is about. So, Madam President, what I think we have got to do is defeat this proposal. I think we have got to urge our fellow Americans to stand up and say no to tax breaks for those who don't need it. I think we have got to work in a very serious way about creating the millions and millions of good-paying jobs that this country desperately needs. I personally believe that far more effective approach than giving the variety of business taxes that were in this proposal at a time when corporate America is sitting on $2 million of unused cash. They've got the money. I think a much better approach, as I said earlier, is investing in our crumbling infrastructure. I think that makes us healthier and stronger as a nation for the future and in the global economy. And I think it creates jobs quicker and in a more cost-effective way than these tax cuts. I think also, Madam President, that it is high time that the American people move. They want us to move in an entirely new direction in terms of trade. I am always amazed how Republicans and Democrats alike, and I speak as the longest-serving independent in Congress, come election time, I see these ads on television, oh, we got to do something about outsourcing. We got to do something about our trade policy. But somehow the day after that election, when corporate America continues to throw American workers out on the street, moves to China, moves to other low-wage countries, somehow that discussion ceases to exist and that legislation never seems to appear. So it seems to me, Madam President, that we have got to defeat this proposal, that in defeating this proposal, we are going to tell the American people that there are at least some of us here who understand what our jobs and our obligations are, and that is that we are supposed to represent them, the middle class of this country, and not just wealthy campaign contributors or bow to the interest of the lobbyists who are all over this place. You know, Madam President, when I talked a moment ago about the need to invest in our infrastructure as a way to create jobs, being more cost-effective than some of these business tax breaks, I'm looking right now at a Wall Street Journal article, December 9th, 2010. And here's what the article says. Headline, companies cling to cash. It's the headline, companies cling to cash. Coffers swell to 51-year high as cautious firms put off investing in growth. It's a story by Justin Lahart. Here's the story. Makes the point that I've been trying to express here. Corporate America's cash pile has hit its highest level in half a century. Rather than pouring their money into building plants or hiring workers, non-financial companies in the United States were sitting on $1.93 trillion in cash. I said $2 trillion. I stand corrected. $1.93 trillion in cash and other liquid assets at the end of September, up from $1.8 trillion at the end of June, the Federal Reserve said Thursday. Cash accounted for 7.4% of the company's total assets, the largest share since 1959. The cash buildup shows the deep caution many companies feel about investing in expansion while the economic recovery remains painfully slow and high unemployment and battered household finances continue to limit consumers' ability to spend. Well, what have we been talking about all afternoon? This is the Wall Street Journal, frankly, not my favorite paper, but that is what they are saying, is that the way you're going to get the economy moving again is to put money in the hands of working people who will then go out and buy the goods and services that these companies produce. I have my doubts about whether or not these tax breaks will in fact have the desired result. But as I said earlier, and will say again, I think the most effective way to create jobs, the most important way to create jobs, is to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. And that is our roads, our bridges, our rail systems, our water systems, our wastewater plants, our dams, our levees, the need to improve broadband, to make sure that every community in America has access to good quality broadband, has access to cell phone service. Unfortunately, as best as I can understand, there has not been one nickel appropriated in this piece of legislation, this proposed legislation, which would go to infrastructure improvements. So, Madam President, I think that this proposal should be defeated because it is not a strong proposal for the middle class. It is a proposal which gives much too much to people who don't need it. And it is a proposal which I think sets the stage for similar type proposals down the pike. And I apologize to anyone who has been listening for any length of time, and I know that I've been, to say the least, a bit repetitious. But the concern here is that when the President and some of my Republican colleagues talk about some of these tax breaks being temporary, we're just going to extend them for 2 years, talking about this payroll tax holiday being just 1 year. I have been in Washington long enough to know that assertion just doesn't fly. That what is temporary today is long-term tomorrow and is permanent the next day. So I fear very much that this proposal is bad on the surface. I fear very much that this proposal will lead us down a very bad track in terms of more trickle-down economics, which benefits the tricklers and not the ordinary Americans. So I think that it is a proposal which should be defeated. But, Madam President, the point that I want to make is that is not just my point of view. I think it should be defeated. I think we can do a lot better. But I've got to tell you that the calls that are coming in to my office are, here's what we got today, I guess. 2,122 calls oppose the deal, and I think 100 calls are supportive of the deal. So you can do the arithmetic on it. But that is at least 95% of the calls that I got today are saying this is not a good deal. We can do better. And I know that in the last 3 or 4 days we've gotten probably now 6,000 or 7,000 calls that say this. And this is not just Vermont. And many of those calls come from out of state, by the way, not just from Vermont. But I think that is true all over this country. So, Madam President, let me conclude, and it has been a long day. Let me simply say that I believe the proposal that was developed by the President and the Republicans are nowhere near as good as we can achieve. I don't know that we are able ourselves to get the handful of Republicans that we need to say no to this agreement. But I do believe that if the American people stand up, and by the way, it may not just be Republicans, there may be some Democrats as well. If the American people stand up and say, we can do better than this, that we don't need to drive up the national debt by giving tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires, that if the American people are prepared to stand and we're prepared to follow them, I think we can defeat this proposal. I think we can come up with a better proposal which better reflects the needs of the middle class and working families of our country, and to me, most importantly, the children of our country. And with that, Madam President, I would yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.